You know, the basics of life are usually the things we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, like socks. If you ever had the thing happen where a thread breaks loose on your sock and you like pick at it and then it unravels the whole thing, well, Viking socks didn't do that. I happened to discover a while ago that the Vikings didn't knit. In fact, knitting, the way we think of it now today with two knitting needles that go back and forth like this, is actually a really recent invention. When I say recent, I mean the 1300s. It was imported from the Moors when they conquered Spain. Before that, in ancient Egypt, Viking times, and Roman times, the way everybody made their socks and hats and mittens was with a totally different technique, and it's called Nalbinding. You've probably seen needles like this before in museums and assumed that ancient people were sewing burlap. They weren't. Turns out these aren't actually for stitching garments together, they're actually for making new ones. The technique goes something like this. You have a short length of thread that you pull through a series of loops. And as it goes through and through and through, you form new loops and you're able to create something that looks like knitting. In fact, there are certain techniques, such as the Coptic stitch, that you have to bring in textile experts when you find them because they look so much like modern knitting it's almost impossible to tell them apart. The difference is, rather than just pulling a loop through, like in knitting or crochet, you actually pull the entire thread through. And what this means is, you can't unravel them. If you puncture a hole in a Viking Age sock and attempt to pull on that thread, it seals its own breach. It doesn't unravel the whole thing. Awesome, right? In addition to this, the fabric produced can be extremely high quality, very stretchy, very pleasant to look at, very pleasant to hold, and the technique that's used to make it is not machine reproducible. Similar to the way a sewing machine has to cheat in order to get something like a stitch that goes through and then up and then through, this technique is not one that a machine, or at least any machine we've made so far, can do unless it had robotic hands that did exactly what I do. As the work progresses, whenever you finish a string, you have to tie on a new one. And as a result, there are a lot of knots in Nalbinding. You can see them here and here and here. Personally, I wonder how comfortable socks could be using this technique, but I'm going to have to try out a pair before I can make that final judgment. One interesting thing about this technique is that it uses short segments of string. You don't work off of an entire ball all at once. And this is something very different from modern knit and crochet, is it fits in very well with weaving. When you weave, you cut off the ends that were tied onto the loom. You end up with a bunch of pieces of thread that you ordinarily would just throw away in a modern context. But this technique of Nalbinding actually allows you to use those directly. That one particular detail makes this technique so much more interesting in context of the way life used to be lived, as it is a very frugal way of doing things. Nothing is wasted when you weave. Well, there you have it. I've just come to the end of this thread, so I'm going to have to tie on a new one. Hopefully the knots won't hurt too much. This is probably the most hipster knitting video you have ever seen in your life. If you have any interest in learning how to Nalbind, check out this channel. She speaks both in Finnish and English, and her videos are absolutely terrific. I followed her video on how to do the Oslo Stitch in order to do basically every bit of Nalbinding I've ever done. If you do go and check out her channel, be sure to give us a comment describing what it is that you made first and how long it took you to do it. And if you are new to the channel, please give us a like and a thumbs up and subscribe.